All right. So good afternoon, everyone. It is my very great pleasure to welcome you all for this first in a series of several talks in Path to Peace Kosovo Kansas Web Forum. I'm Dr. Milosevic. I am director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, the center that was awarded $2,000 from the Public Education for Peace Building Support Initiative of the United States Institute of Peace. And these funds enable our center to host these weekly web forums throughout the month of February. In these forum meetings, we will meet experts from the Balkans region and Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, who will share their firsthand experience and knowledge of Kosovo's path to independence. I would like to also extend my gratitude to a number of co-sponsors of this project. These are Democracy for Development Institute, a non-governmental organization located in Pristina, Kosovo. Then there is the Institute for Military History and Security Studies program at Kansas State University. I would like to thank Foreign Military Studies Office, or FIMSO, at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and CKC, Cultural Knowledge Consortium, also at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. I would also like to thank Center for Global and International Studies at the University of Kansas. As it was already said, these weekly forums will take place here on campus of the University of Kansas every Monday at noon during the month of February. All these events are open to public and free. Community members are welcome to attend these lectures or participate in the web forum online. And before I introduce our today's speaker, I especially want to thank someone in our office who has put in a great deal of work developing the concept, writing the grant proposal, and working through her own personal context to put together an amazing group of speakers for this web series. And this is our own Chris, program coordinator, Adrian Landry. So thank you very much, Adrian. All right, and the speaker for today's forum is Raymond Finch, who is a Eurasian military analyst working for the Foreign Military Studies Office, or FIMSO, at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Mr. Finch has produced a number of analytical studies dealing with the Russian military and society, and he is both an editor and frequent contributor to FIMSO's, it's a weekly or monthly, what's the name of the Operation Watch, a very famous and popular monthly magazine. So prior to this, he worked for many years as the associate director of KU CREES. Mr. Finch is a RIS alumnus himself, and he earned his master's at KU before serving as a Eurasian Foreign Area Officer for the U.S. Army in Germany, Korea, Russia, and CONUS. Upon retiring from the military, he spent a year as the Director of Corporate Security for Kroll Associates in Moscow. So today he will be speaking on the background of the conflict in Kosovo. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you for taking time to listen to my comments today. Wait till the PowerPoint is up there. A couple of caveats before we begin. This topic is incredibly complex, and there's no way I can cover it all within 30 minutes. And therefore, we'll have to rely upon some summaries and gross generalizations. Another caveat is my general lack of expertise. I've never been to Kosovo, and I was already retired from the military and working in Moscow when the conflict started. I make no claims, therefore, to be a Kosovar expert. Where to begin? What was the primal cause for the conflict which arose in the late 1990s and which ultimately led to Kosovo's independence? Let's remind ourselves where Kosovo is located. If we focus in, you can see that Kosovo sits in the center of the Balkans, a tough neighborhood, with Serbia as its northern neighbor and Albania to the south. Here's the essence of the conflict. Some Serbs believe that Kosovo is an integral part of the Serbian state, while the mostly Albanian population living in Kosovo thinks otherwise. Where did this Serbian belief come from? If you go back 1,000 years, there once was a Serbian kingdom which laid claim to this region. These claims changed as the Ottoman Empire moved into Europe. Serb patriots will single out the year 1389 with the Battle of the Field of Blackbirds on Kosovo Pole, when the Turkish Ottoman forces defeated the Serb military. In subsequent Serb mythology, this battle has often been portrayed as Serbia sacrificing its nation, Christ-like, to stop the Islamic advance into Europe. The region would remain under Ottoman rule for the next 5 centuries. On the other hand, Kosovo also has a particular significance to ethnic Albanians, who believe that they are the original inhabitants and who have an equal claim to the territory. Let's rush forward 500 years to the 20th century. A century ago, as the Ottoman Empire was now collapsing, there was an ugly war in the Balkans, with the Serbs reoccupying Kosovo. To put it mildly, it was a savage reoccupation, and there was plenty of blood spilt to cause ill feelings between Serbs and Albanians for the next 100 years. The general slaughter of the First World War did not help matters. After the war, when the victors were redrawing the map of Europe, Kosovo, with its majority Albanian population, was included now in the newly formed state of the Kingdom of Southern Slavs, or what later became known as Yugoslavia. It's important to point out that the borders of Yugoslavia had been drawn quite arbitrarily and with little regard for specific ethnic distribution. Ethnic groups were lumped together with the naive belief that they would somehow get along. The interwar years were strained between the Serbs and the Albanians now living in Yugoslavia. When World War II started, ethnic tensions returned with a vengeance, only adding to the long list of grievances and atrocities. Following World War II, under the Yugoslav leader Tito, the communist country was purportedly operating under the Marxist slogan where, quote, workers of all nations would unite, and where ethnic differences were supposedly not taken into account. The enemy was now the capitalist West. Living conditions for the Albanians living in Kosovo did improve under Tito, particularly in the realms of health and education, although ethnic tensions continued to simmer. In 1974, Yugoslavia wrote a new constitution granting Kosovo autonomous status. Although not quite a republic, Kosovo enjoyed considerable autonomy, and Kosovar Albanians began to move into positions of authority. Demographics also played a role, as ethnic Albanian Muslims with the highest birth rate in Europe had become a majority in Kosovo. In the 1980 census, Albanians made up nearly 80% of the population. Albanian nationalism increased, with the Albanian national flag often flown, the Albanian language taught in schools instead of Serbo-Croatian used elsewhere in Yugoslavia, and ethnic Albanians now controlling access to jobs in the socialist state. After Tito's death in 1980, there were increased calls by Albanian nationalists seeking greater independence for Kosovo. They wanted to become a republic, which caused more frequent clashes with police, often Serbs. I happened to visit Sarajevo in 1984, the Winter Olympics, and at the time they were already talking about this was a crisis waiting to happen. As the appeal of socialist ideology continued to fade, it was supplanted by a virulent nationalism, practiced by many in Yugoslavia, but perhaps best personified by the Serb leader Slobodan Milosevic. Milosevic was an expert in using nationalism to secure his hold on power. In 1987, Milosevic visited Kosovo, assuring the Serbs living there that Kosovo would forever be a part of Serbia. In '89, on the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo Pole, he spoke to nearly 1 million Serbs in Belgrade, hinting that they soon might have to again fight for Kosovo. That same year, '89, after Milosevic became president, he stripped Kosovo of its autonomy, forcing Albanians from their state jobs, shutting down the media, and repressing the Albanian language. Many of the best jobs now went to Serbs. In 1990, Milosevic dissolved the provincial government, and sent in Serbian troops and paramilitary forces for security. In 91, Kosovar separatists declared a republic, receiving recognition from neighboring Albania, and electing Ibrahim Rugova as president the following year. Rugova was a believer in the Gandhi method of peaceful resistance, and he hoped to internationalize the Kosovo issue. It's important to point out that the Kosovars merely wanted greater autonomy within Yugoslavia. Many thought that the dissolution of Yugoslavia would begin in Kosovo, but it were the other republics that first broke away. Slovenes, Croats, and Bosnians feared the nationalism preached by Milosevic and his plans to create a larger Serboslavia to replace Yugoslavia. After they declared their independence, fighting commenced. While the UN did what it could, fighting continued, particularly in Bosnia. It would take a couple of years and hundreds of thousands of casualties before the US and NATO got directly involved and a peace agreement was worked out, particularly in Bosnia. Recall that the US played the key role in stopping the conflict in Bosnia, hammering out the Dayton Peace Agreement in '95. There you can see Mr. Holbrooke, who was then Assistant Secretary of State, escorting Milosevic to the conference. This is an important point, as some in Washington believed that without direct US involvement, there would be no peace in the Balkans. Unfortunately, the Dayton Agreement was silent about the issue of Kosovo, and at this point, many Kosovars began to wonder whether their peaceful approach toward conflict resolution would work. Moreover, the Kosovar Albanians were perturbed that the former Slav states of Slovenia, Croatia, and to a lesser degree Bosnia were able to declare and fight for their independence, while they were stuck in a loveless marriage with Serbia. The situation grew worse in '97 after neighboring Albania collapsed into economic chaos. Huge military stockpiles were looted, and some of it ended up in the hands of the recently formed Kosovo Liberation Army, the KLA, which had previously been regarded as a terrorist organization by some in the US. The situation continued to deteriorate throughout '97-'98 as the cycle of violence grew ever more vicious. Serb security forces employed greater force to fight what they claimed was an armed insurgency. This disproportionate force caused the KLA to respond in kind. Serb forces would then retaliate using even greater force, often against the Albanian civilian population. In October '98, U.S. Special Envoy Richard Holbrooke, again, who thought that he knew how Milosevic operated, negotiated a ceasefire. It didn't last long. Serbs claimed the KLA was at fault, while Kosovars blamed the Serbs. Soon there were fresh reports of Serb massacres of Albanian Kosovars. And it was at this point that the US and NATO first threatened to use force to defend Kosovar Albanians and punish Serb paramilitary forces. Milosevic, however, was not intimidated. In a sort of a last-ditch effort to find a diplomatic solution, the contact group in NATO sponsored a conference in France. Serb leaders questioned the legitimacy of NATO getting involved in what they believed was an internal domestic affair. Part of the proposed agreement was a NATO occupation of Kosovo, and not surprisingly, the Serbs would not accept this, quote, invasion of their sovereignty. NATO again threatened Serbia with bombing if they rejected the agreement, but Serbia still refused. Because the proposed agreement did not include specific language guaranteeing Kosovo independence, according to some accounts, it took the personal involvement and arm twisting of then Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, before the Kosovo delegation signed the accords. NATO planning for the conflict had been going on for some months. General Wesley Clark, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, who also claimed to understand how Milosevic thought, had
For those of you online, please stand by. We're trying to get it reconnected. For those of you online, if you could just please stand by. We're trying to get Mr. Finch's microphone and camera back working. It's good enough for the Super Bowl. It's good enough for us. So we appreciate your patience. Thanks. And we'll be starting up here shortly. Stand by.
Anyway, General Clark thought that Milosevic and the Serbs would give up after a short period. And indeed, some planners had actually thought that 48 hours of bombing would prove sufficient. To gain domestic political support, President Clinton publicly announced that the U.S. would not employ ground forces to evict the Serb paramilitary from Kosovo. NATO airstrikes against Serbia and Kosovo began on 24 March. At the same time, Serb forces began a long-planned, massive military assault on the KLA and civilian cities and towns with KLA sympathies, forcing thousands of Kosovar Albanians to flee. U.S. and NATO leaders were still hoping that the, quote, shock and awe of their advanced military power would intimidate the Serbs into a quick submission. After about a week of bombing, however, it became apparent that air power alone might not stop the Serbs from continuing their ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. The situation on the ground became much worse, with thousands of refugees now fleeing. Indeed, some claim that the NATO bombing had exacerbated the refugee situation, forcing hundreds of thousands of Kosovars to flee across the borders into Albania, Macedonia, and Montenegro, adding to the ethnic tensions in these regions. By mid-April, things were not looking good. In late April '99, NATO had planned to celebrate its 50th anniversary with high-level meetings in Washington. When first envisioned, the event was going to be a gala affair, but with the conflict in Kosovo becoming ever more problematic, officials toned down the rhetoric in the celebrations. There were now rumors that this conflict had the potential to damage or break the alliance, as some members questioned the general strategy or utility of relying upon air power alone. Planning began for a possible ground operation. There were also growing concerns that the bombing could spark a larger conflict with Russia. As a traditional ally of Serbia, Russians were particularly incensed at the continued NATO bombing, and President Yeltsin hinted that Russia might retaliate. NATO leaders believed, however, that they had to press on. The alliance had staked its reputation on this conflict, and so victory was essential. The price of poker continued to rise, as limited bombing was not stopping the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. As the war dragged on, NATO began to bomb an ever greater number of targets in Serbia, to include the capital. By the end of May, about a third of the Albanian Kosovar population had been expelled from Kosovo. After 78 days of bombing on 10 June, Milosevic finally agreed to NATO's demands to pull out all of his security forces from Kosovo. Why? NATO's bombing was certainly a factor. He may have also feared the ground invasion, and he likely felt some domestic pressure. The major reason, however, as far as I can tell, centered upon the Russian decision not to provide Milosevic with diplomatic and perhaps military support. To put this conflict in context, I want to spend just a couple of slides on the post-war Phase 4 period. Unfortunately, even with the presence of thousands of UN and NATO forces, everyone did not live happily ever after. More than 200,000 Serbs living in Kosovo fled back to Serbia as the Serb forces pulled out. Much of the country was in ruins with little effective local government. Aggravating these problems were huge economic challenges. From the Serb perspective, it didn't appear that US and NATO were planning to leave Kosovo anytime soon. In what was labeled part of New Europe by then Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, the US would go on to construct one of its largest overseas military bases. Some 3 months prior to 9/11, President Bush visited Kosovo, where he gave the troops a pep talk, and I just have a quote here. "America has a vital interest in European stability, and therefore peace in the region. Our goal is to hasten the day when peace is self-sustaining, and when local democratically elected authorities can assume full responsibility." But the democracy building was not going so well, especially where there remained sharp ethnic differences. 3 years after Bush's visit, rioting broke out in many areas of Kosovo where there were Serb enclaves. The violence indicated that Kosovo's ill-defined political status wasn't working. Was it independent, part of Serbia, a UN protectorate? And if it was, what does this mean? It also reflected some of the ineffectiveness of the international military and police presence to effectively protect minorities. A year later, here's what the ethnic map looked like. The Serb areas to the north of the Ibar River were effectively run by Serbia. Milosevic died while waiting trial for war crimes at The Hague in 2006. Some hoped that Serbia would now be prepared to move in a new direction. While on his way to a G8 summit in Germany, President Bush, as the first American leader to ever visit Albania, announced that, quote, "Enough is enough. Kosovo is independent." His remarks helped to undermine the negotiations that were going on between Serbia, Kosovo, and the UN over its future political status. Serbia held presidential elections at the beginning of 2008, where it essentially came down to a contest between the pro-West incumbent Tadic and the nationalist Nikolic. The election was seen as a referendum on Serbia's relations with Europe, where one formula suggested that the EU would offer membership to Serbia in exchange for concessions on Kosovo. Some 2 weeks later, the province of Kosovo declared independence from Serbia. The new government promised to protect the rights of ethnic minorities. Not surprisingly, Serbia, Russia, and a number of other countries objected to this declaration. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. It didn't take Russia very long to apply this new standard of global security to a couple of regions close to them. There have been some high-level American visits to the region, and any U.S. politician will be worshipped in Kosovo. This may have some dangerous consequences, which we will discuss in the conclusion. After 4 years of supervised independence, and as a sign that Kosovo is now capable of governing itself, this office closed last September. There are still questions, however, whether Kosovo can provide the necessary security to allow democratic institutions to develop and to protect ethnic minorities. So today, some 7,000 foreign security personnel remain stationed in the country. Rather than conclusions, which has a definitive sound to it, perhaps suppositions is a more apt description for the understandings one might draw from this conflict. There was nothing inevitable about Kosovo gaining its independence, and there were a number of different factors involved. As a believer in realpolitik, however, I maintain the primary factor was the courage of those brave Kosovars who were willing to fight for their freedom. One might ask why the U.S. believed that it had a role in resolving this conflict. Some of the reason stems from the earlier efforts to stop the fighting in Bosnia. At the core of U.S. involvement, however, was the belief that the U.S. was the, quote, sole superpower, the indispensable nation, the global policeman. The conflict between the Serbs and the Kosovar Albanians grew most violent just as the U.S. was at the height of its power in '99, whether that power was real or imaginary. But if the U.S. was so strong, would it then become complicit if it failed to stop atrocities in places like Kosovo? If the global policeman observed some thug violating an innocent person in his neighborhood, he must intervene if he wants to maintain his authority. So too, the U.S., by virtue of its claims as the sole superpower, found it increasingly difficult to pretend that this conflict was of no national interest. People like Miss Albright argued that the U.S. had an obligation to use its economic, political, military, and some even wrote about U.S. moral power to force little troublesome countries like Serbia to submit. There was a similar logic in NATO's involvement. What was the point of maintaining the most successful military alliance on the planet if these forces were unwilling to help restore peace in Europe? It is important to note that this was the first time that NATO had attacked a sovereign nation which had neither attacked any alliance member nor its neighbors. In searching for a post-Cold War mission, some suggested that NATO should become a global military force. This may have been the only war in modern history where the aggressor or initiator, and here I mean NATO, did not suffer a single combat casualty. While I don't have any evidence to prove it, I suspect that this impressive victory may have played some small part in deciding to invade Iraq 4 years later. There was, and perhaps still is, a belief that the technological advantages enjoyed by the U.S. military would guarantee a quick victory and remove the fog of war. In a broader geopolitical sense, the conflict in Kosovo may have also established some new precedents. Unable to secure the approval of the UN Security Council, the U.S. and NATO still went ahead and initiated hostilities against the sovereign nation. From a cynic's perspective, The security model developed after World War II and enshrined in the United Nations had been damaged and could now be summed up as the strong do what they want. 4 years later, the U.S. again would decide to use military force without first gaining the approval of the UN Security Council. I think that one might conclude that questions of self-determination or human rights may take precedence today over the concept of territorial integrity. For good or ill, Kosovo has become a symbol of U.S. power in the region. In the future, the U.S. may feel that it must help to defend Kosovo against any aggression. This may come back to haunt leaders in Washington. All things considered, however, I believe that a bad peace is better than a good war. Had the United States and NATO not intervened in '99, this conflict could have easily expanded and many more lives might have been lost. Thank you for your attention. Questions? I think we have a microphone.
Ray, actually, we have a couple of questions from online, which I'll take first, and then we'll go to our audience here. Thank you very much, first, for getting us off to a great start. Carl Prenzla has asked us a question regarding the Albanian population in Kosovo. Given the large Albanian population in Kosovo, was annexation by Albania ever considered as part of the negotiations? By whom or which side?
That's a big question. It depends on the date. You know, if you go back to the Cold War years, you know, back when Tito, okay. The question was, given the large Albanian population in Kosovo, was annexation or just joining with Albania ever considered as a viable alternative? And I think, yes, it was. And in fact, if you go back to you can go back to the Cold War period when, before Tito broke with Moscow, there was talk of creating a Balkan Federation where then Yugoslavia would join with Albania, which I think might have solved, at least for the question of the Albanians, this question of where Kosovo exists. I don't know whether in later, you know, as after the war began, whether Kosovo actually joining Albania was ever an option, a realistic option on the table. It seems to me it ought to have been, but I don't have any knowledge that it was.
Thanks, Ray. Our next question comes from Jay Hunt. He asked, was Kosovo's break from Serbia a function of Serbia's fatigue?
Can you repeat that?
Was Kosovo's break from Serbia a function of Serbian fatigue?
Well, again, it's sort of a novice historian. Oh, yeah. The question was Kosovo's break from Serbia a function of Serbian fatigue? And I would say, as sort of a novice historian, we haven't seen the last chapter yet in this Where Kosovo Lies. So who knows where Kosovo will be. I think, you know, if you go back to 1991, when I made that comment that the dissolution of Yugoslavia, many thought that the dissolution would begin with Kosovo. And at that time, then the senior President Bush, I guess, made some veiled threats to the Serbian leaders, don't touch Kosovo, stay out of Kosovo, and they didn't. And so I think they've, you know, known for a long time that there were those who thought that you couldn't keep on treating the Kosovar Albanians as second-class citizens and still hope to hold on to this region. It was an apartheid-type situation. I don't know that it's over yet. You know, if you were to talk to President Nikolic, who's now the president of Serbia, and if he was in this classroom right now, he would say that Kosovo is a part of Serbia, period. And we need to go to operate from that principle. So I don't know if fatigue has set in. It depends who you talk to. I think some Serbs would say, no, it is not. It will remain forever ad infinitum part of Serbia.
Our next question comes from, this is from our colleagues at Kansas State University. Dave Stone is asking, you mentioned overconfidence as a result of no NATO combat casualties. One thing that Dr. Stone evidently noted at the time was a crisis of confidence on the part of the U.S. Air Force over the failure of bombing alone to bring victory. Has that self-searching gone away?
Well, I don't know. General Short, who was the Air Force, the guy in charge of air operations for NATO, I don't think it was a question. General Short would say that his hands were tied. In fact, the Air Force planners, they really wanted to do sort of a Gulf War I type special. Let's pull out all the stops and we will level Belgrade. So I don't know if I think he's since come around, General Short, and now retired, to believe that to reach those political ends, they couldn't unleash the full power of the military. So I don't know that it was, I think, trying to bomb the Serbs into submission from 3 miles up. These guys were at 15,000 feet trying to hit targets on the ground, spotters. I think that confidence was damaged. I don't think broken, because today we're using drones from about that same thing, and we're taking out targets pretty effectively. So no, to go back to Professor Stone's question, was the Air Force's confidence damaged in this operation? I would say from the Air Force, they would say that they were never given the real opportunity to demonstrate all the cards they had. And he felt, I know in an interview he gave for Frontline later on, he expressed some frustration that his hands were tied by the politicians. He would have brought Serbia to its knees after 24 hours if he had been in charge of that.
We still have several questions online, but I think we're going to cut to somebody actually in the room with Ray, and we have a question in the audience.
I have a question to follow up on some of your conclusions, specifically on the bad peace better than the good war. And you already started talking about this a little bit in terms of one of the options that Kosovo would have joined Albania that would possibly have prevented the military response. But I was wondering, considering what was actually happening in Kosovo at that time with Serbian population, what in your mind were some of the reasonable peaceful options of the conflict resolution? Like reasonable, actually implementable, peaceful options. And the other question that I have has to do with the similarity between this situation and what happened in 2008 in Georgia. And I was wondering, what are the explanations of the difference of United States and NATO position with regard to those two cases? How would you explain that United States and NATO took a position of pretty much neutrality in case of Georgia, as we're talking about?
I'm not sure I completely understood the first question, so let me take the second question first with regard to August 2008 and the United States response to that. I think that if you looked in the military's cupboard in August 2008, we were still pulling back from Iraq. We were fully deployed in Afghanistan. That wasn't good. There was not a whole lot in the cupboard to respond to that. We couldn't really deploy a brigade or a division to, not that we ever thought we would. I think that smarter heads prevailed. And I think that, again, it was a question of realpolitik, that when the military planners thought and looked at the map and said, what could we do we are not all Georgians, despite what Mr. McCain said, and we didn't have a lot to move in there and we weren't going to fall on our sword, begin thermonuclear war to keep a unified Georgia. Plus, I think from the Russian perspective, they did have some claims. Who threw the first punch? I think most people will now say that the question or the answer may be ambiguous, but it appears that the Georgians may have bombed Sinvali, at least unleashed that. Whether they were provoked or not, that's a different question. And so, if the United States had backed the Georgians at that point, they might have been seen as backing the aggressor. Are things the same? A bad peace better than a good war? Oh, what do I mean by a bad peace? I particularly believe in the garbage can theory of history, the peace that we have, we're forever putting duct tape and baling wire to keep these things going along. And if you don't break the cycle of violence, that if my son is killed, I'm going to keep up that violence. And if we don't break it somewhere, even as painful it is to break that cycle of violence, the thing will go on forever. And that's why I think that whether in Bosnia or whether in Kosovo in 1999, a bad peace, despite all the problems with it, it's better than a good war because it's the only way to break that cycle of violence. And hopefully something can be. I don't think Kosovo is over with. I think, for instance, those northern regions, I mean, I think that they will likely end up going into Serbia. I don't think, because today, if you look to the mandate today in February 2013, Pristina doesn't control those areas, and I don't think Serbia is going to give them up without some sort of struggle. So I don't think the partitioning is quite done yet, and they might be able to hopefully work towards some negotiated settlement, not have a conflict over those regions.
Actually, I think we're going to cut to the our folks online for just a second. The next question comes from Mark Wilcox.
Hello, Mark.
And it's a long one.
Okay.
An understanding of the Kosovo saga must include a study of the involvement of the international community in Kosovo during the period of ceasefire, from the conclusion of the Holbrooke-Milosevic agreement until the beginning of the NATO air campaign. The OSCE deployed a large mission of observers, backed in part by a NATO aerial verification mission and a NATO extraction force. The U.S. strongly supported this effort, which was an attempt to create conditions to alleviate suffering and possibly allow for further negotiations. Did the whole Kosovo campaign episode signal a failure, or at least the limitations of the international systems after the Cold War?
No, and Mark, please forgive me. Mark described, I don't know if everyone heard the question about the what occurred between 1998 until bombing began in March of '99. There was a host of measures, and again, as I said at the outset, I've had to rely on some gross generalizations. So no, I don't think. I would say that, again, I don't want to sound cynical because I'm not. I think a good faith attempts were made to work out some sort of negotiated settlement. But I would also say in 1998, my impression, reading what I've read, leaders in Washington had already put the Serbs as in the enemy camp. That they had sided with one side against Serbia, and I think the Serbs felt that because the transition of the KLA from a terrorist organization in '97 to now a freedom-fighting organization reflects some of this evolving understanding of what the West wanted in Kosovo. Were they terrorists? Well, if they're terrorists, then yes, we're going to side with Serbia in crushing these terrorists. Well, at some point, saying that no, they weren't terrorists, they were actually fighting for some greater degree of independence. Where that occurred, and why that occurred, I would say one partial reason was folks like Mrs. Albright, Richard Holbrooke, had dealt with Milosevic earlier. They had said that, this guy's not a straight shooter, he's not in our camp, not an ally, and they put him in the enemy camp, and it all stemmed from that.
Right, I'm going to skip one question, just because we've got sort of an interesting question with regard to the use of symbols. But I want to assure our folks at K-State that we will get back to them. The question has to do with, what role symbols play still in Kosovo. For example, the flag of Kosovo, the ethnic Albanian flag of the two-headed eagle. If that's so, what is the possibility of creating a new identity of all ethnic groups in Kosovo to create a civil society? What's your take on this?
Oh, yeah, I'm not prepared to answer that. I know symbols are huge. They're fighting over. I just read that some statue to an Albanian freedom fighter that's located in a Serb province in southern Serbia was destroyed recently. I know these are huge issues with regard to establishing or helping to establish an ethnic identity. If Kosovo is going to be a fully independent country, then yes, they probably need to come up with fully independent symbols that don't resemble Albanian symbols. That would be my, I wish I could elaborate more. I agree that symbols are very important. How they're established, though, is beyond me.
Thank you. Yep. Our next question comes from the audience.
I was just wondering about if you could speak a little bit to the spillover effect, because the conflict has not stopped. It has just shifted mainly to Macedonia, where interesting fighting.
She talked about the spillover effect, and she's absolutely right. One of these maps had the Albanian population. Again, they're all over the place there. Let's see if you go back and look at this. Encompasses some of the areas where those Albanians are ethnic Albanian population. The only thing I would say is, the ankle bone is connected to the foot bone, which is connected to the knee, and if it hurts somewhere, if your toe hurts, there's a likelihood that it will spread and cause problems elsewhere. I'm sorry, I'm not that well read, though, to talk about the issue in Macedonia. Question here? Oh.
Yeah, let me, first of all, I want to let you know that Wilcox says that you're forgiven. But our next question online has to do with, again, it's from Dave Stone at Kansas State University. Granting that a bad peace is better than a good war, the post-war settlement, and particularly the recognition of Kosovo, led fairly clearly to war in Serbia. Do you see any self-searching or second thoughts in U.S. policy circles about recognizing separatist movements in the wake of the Georgia problems?
Yes, I would say that, it's a slow learning process, a painful learning process, but yes, I think that, when I think about what's going on in Syria today, for instance, why there hasn't been a greater, let's say, movement within the Washington Beltway for the United States to get involved, I think we're, I would say, beginning to get a little gun-shy about using military force, or the belief that military force will necessarily lead to a good conclusion. I know that that doesn't necessarily answer the question. I think the United States, we have damaged those international security bodies that were developed after the Second World War. I think it will be a slow process for the United States, again, to show that, yes, we are a team international player. We're going to abide by the team international rules, even when it doesn't suit our interests. I think we're slowly beginning to recover that.
Thank you, Ray. We're going to take one more question from our audience.
I did have.
I was wondering, kind of in regards to Russia's involvement, you had one picture where you had the Serbian and Russian flag kind of juxtaposed.
Oh, right, yeah.
Do you know,
yes.
Can you speak to whether that is kind of a grassroots movement, or was that a domestic politicalization of Russia's interests in Serbia? Because the way that I've done a little bit of research on the topic, and the way I understand it is that really Russia was mainly concerned with kind of losing its sphere of influence and being excluded from the international process. And then, I guess, second part to the question, do you think that affected their decision-making in regards to such a trying to reestablish and really reaffirm Russian sphere of influence?
Again, I was working in Moscow at the time, so again, I probably have been maybe too Kremlin-focused position on this issue. No, you got to go back to 1998. Russia was going through some very difficult economic times. They were not really in any position to put up a robust defense to plans from the West, U.S. to dictate what went on there. You remember, there's Mr. Primakov there standing next to President Yeltsin. You remember the famous incident. He's on his way to Washington to talk about this. He gets word of the bombing, turns around mid-flight. No, I would say that President Yeltsin was at the far end of the liberal spectrum. The people I was talking to, the average Russians, they were very upset that this was going on. If you read what was coming out of the Duma at the time, this is the beginning of World War III. And what's more important, just like 2008, in the Russian ability to create an entire mythology about what happened, that they stood up to not only Georgia, but to the west, the United States of Georgia, 2008. The same thing, Kosovo in 2009, there's an incredible mythology on the Russian side surrounding this. That why did this happen? It happened because Russia was weak, and the West took advantage of Russian weakness to establish its mandate without considering or taking into account the Kremlin concerns. So, no, I think there was, and is to this day, a belief among, I don't know what percentage of Russians, but that they have spilt a lot of blood in the Balkans over the last couple of centuries. That gives them a certain say in how things are run.
Let me go back to the internet. We've got a slew of questions here. I'm going to take one that is a little bit off the beaten path. One of our guests asks, how realistic is the likelihood that organized crime in the Balkans, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo and Albania could become a threat to the United States security?
I don't know. What about organized crime in this country? No, it is a problem. And I think, going back to 2008 and Kosovo's declaration of independence, I know that some of the method behind the madness was this indeterminate political status. What are you? Are you independent? Are you, that gray, let's call it a state, let's declare our independence, and now we can work on establishing those real structures of government that will help to dispel some of the corruption, some of the gray areas. Could it be, a threat to the United States organized crime? Again, my experience working in Moscow for a year for this business intelligence firm, I no longer see those nice, neat lines between criminal behavior and business behavior and government behavior. They kind of mix. In places like the Balkans or in these new states like Kosovo, there's a greater tendency. However, I need to go back just about a month now. There was a very interesting article in the New York Times about American business interest in Kosovo. And lo and behold, some of the most interesting now business partners, U.S. business partners operating in Kosovo, you'll never believe their names. People like Madeleine Albright, General Clark, people who were on the ground. Now they are involved heavily, for instance, in the telecommunications and some of the infrastructure development within Kosovo. So again, I'm too much of a cynic to say that, yes, organized crime is going to come from there and invade us. It might work the other way around, to be perfectly frank. I don't want to.
Another guest is asking, let me see if I can find the question here. Do you think that post-war agreements have consolidated local nationalisms, thus forcing ethnic cleansing and consolidating communities across ethno-nationalistic lines? If so, how does this contradict EU's efforts for European integration?
I don't think there is any one-way process going on. Is nationalism growing throughout the region? You could certainly make the case, whether you look anywhere in Europe, that yes, whether it's German nationalism, whether it's Hungarian, yes, more people. But at the same time, you have these global processes going on, the EU, the internet, and so I can't really say whether, and as an American, I'm in a poor position to judge because I've never felt the ethnic, I'll say, some of the ethnic tensions that some of these other people have. I haven't, from my mother's milk, I haven't been brought up on that. And so I don't hate like some of these people hate. I remember talking to a Chechen, talking about how he looked at Russians. And his hate to the Russians was palpable. And it really stemmed from, what he was exposed to as a child, notwithstanding the war. So I'm in a poor position to judge whether or not ethnic nationalism is becoming more of a problem. I will say from a political standpoint, people like Milosevic, any politician can gain a lot of points by pulling out the flag and waving it. And it's one of those perennial, unending problems. So I don't know if it's a greater problem today or not.
Let me just share with you, Ray, a few of our comments from people online. One listener said, Mr. Finch, I must apologize because I did not believe that I would hear such a frank and open discussion. Thank you. And G. Hunt, after your latest comment, says, with Albright's and Clark's investments, Kosovo could be the new Mumbai of call centers. Just a question. Not a question, rather a cynical observation. And then we have another question from K-State. Considering that the United States was a decisive force to Kosovo's independence, would they support the recreation of ethnic Albania, which was dissolved in 1912?
That's a good question. I'm sorry I don't have enough information. I know that just prior to, during the Balkan Wars, there was this London conference in 1913, I think, when they created this Albanian state. I don't think at that time that Kosovo was a part of that Albanian state, that the Serbs had already occupied. If you go back to 1912, they had already occupied Kosovo prior to the London conference. And I remember in subsequent conversations with Milosevic, he would say that, hey, that border was from 1912. In that London conference, and if you guys now want to change the borders, you need to undo this conference that was held 100 years ago. So, sorry, I can't answer it better.
All right, we've got one more question in the room.
Hi, Ray. This question is kind of based on some just anecdotal things I've heard. I spoke with an individual who belongs to Orthodox Church in Kansas, actually. And he's not Serbian, but he had a very strong view about this, about Kosovo and Serbia. And my question is, do you think that the Orthodox Church is playing a divisive role or a rehabilitative role in promoting reconciliation now, or is it, proving a force for divisiveness in this dispute?
I think there are some 1,300 Serbian Orthodox churches and monasteries located in Kosovo. And I want to say that there are probably some clerics within the Orthodox Church that would put, the gospel message up top and say, we've got to love our neighbor. As influential as some of those Orthodox clerics who say that, no, this is the Serbian homeland and we have to be willing to fight and die for this. As you know, ethnicity and religion, they're twin brothers. I would like to say that, well, it is a problem. That if you go online right now and Google Serbian Orthodox Churches Kosovo, you will find 10,000 sites with all of this apocalyptic language about how the Albanians are slaughtering Serbs in their beds at night. Are they sanctioned by the Serbian Orthodox Church? I don't know. I would think that those, again, clerics who are close to the gospel would not be doing that, but they want to protect their property. I mean, I wish I had a better answer. It is a problem.
Folks, I'm not quite sure whether or not my computer seems to have frozen up, and so if there are other messages out there, questions, I do apologize. But given the time, I think we're going to bring this to a close. I want to thank our opening speaker, Mr. Raymond Finch, who I thought did an outstanding job outlining the main background issues to the conflict and getting us off to a great start.
Great. Thank you.